All the preconceptions of darkest Africa aside, flying into Equatorial Guinea represented the culmination of last-minute planning, forged yellow fever certificates, and that heavy feeling in the pit of your gut as you look out the window at the dark green jungle, not knowing what exactly is about to happen to you. I'd read somewhere that the first Europeans walked into the interior in the 1920s, and that even now the country didn't have a road system outside of the capital, Bata. All I could see from the sweaty cabin was dense canopy forest, and at sea, the instrument that was responsible for both the dynamic change in the country, as well as our exploratory trip here, the new oil rig. Everyday life in Equatorial Guinea has been much the same since those early days. Practically on the equator, the country lies south of Cameroon and north of Gabon in central West Africa, and is still shrouded in pristine tropical rainforest, intersected by large rivers that break into vast mangrove systems on the Atlantic coast. It was a result of revenue from the oil operation that a group of consultants were sent to Equatorial Guinea to ascertain the feasibility of tourism in various areas of the coast. This meant defining suitable areas for game fishing and scuba diving in waters that were very thinly charted.
And that comes out and it's gone into the water.
Mike Brokenshaw has been responsible for much of the successful conservation legislation that was set up in South Africa years ago. His experience as a big game fisherman will also be valuable on this trip. Having fished in many different parts of the world, he stands as an excellent advisor for the startup of the sport fishing industry. Steve Ellis is a manufacturer of fishing vessels, both for sport and commercial purposes. He also has commercial fishing experience in other parts of Africa and is an accomplished freediver. Jeremy Williams is co-owner of the Dive Factory, servicing the spearfishing and scuba diving industries in South Africa. He represented South Africa in the sport of spearfishing, and also has experience at running scuba operations, both land-based and liveaboard. Between the three, a detailed report on the status and opportunities of the Equatorial Guinean coastline can be expected. Time is of the essence, and the team has to understand the different areas and possibilities in a relatively short period.
Because of the lack of infrastructure along the mainland in Equatorial Guinea, it would have been very difficult to transport compressors and scuba diving gear along the coast. The only way really to cover a large area was through free diving, basically drifting with the currents. Having experience in spearfishing, you can learn to assess an area in terms of the fish life and the conditions with a fair amount of reliability. You can drift over an area quite quickly, and by looking at the bait fish and the growth on the reef, you can judge whether or not it will support a good game fish population, even if there are not any in the area at the time. When spearfishing, you pre-select the fish that you're going to shoot. You can adjust your catch very accurately according to the sort of pressures that you want to impose on the area in the sea. If a fish is endangered, you can decide before you even go on the dive that you're not going to take it. You're not interfering with it at all if you don't want to take it.
Having adopted this particular philosophy, the team settles into the pilot's compound near Bata Airport and immediately begins planning the days ahead. In the relative luxury of the compound, they decide to explore the immediate surrounds of Bata, the Rio Otonde, and the reefs offshore. This means hitching up Corisco and towing along the track to the Rio Otonde, where a slip has recently been built for the expedition's use. Local knowledge came in the form of Tim Edwards, who has begun spearfishing on some of the reefs closer to shore. Having launched the boat, the explorers set off down current towards the sea. This river is well known for its tarpon, big snapper, giant threadfin, and other big estuarine fish that West Africa is already famous for. Mike and Steve pulled teasers out on the 70-meter line, but to no effect. Fishing blind like this is a hit or miss affair. The boat could be miles from any reef structure. Carisco begins to angle inshore in an attempt to find some shallower reef. Jeremy and Steve kit up with much anticipation and bail over to begin the process of finding some decent structure that would hold the array of species to sustain a sport fishery. The visibility in this area is green and murky. Because of the big rivers flowing out of the jungle and into the sea, the water is clouded by silt and stained by tannin from leaf litter. It takes some time to get used to operating in the warm green water, and after a while Steve and Jeremy begin to locate some fish. Steve comes across the first snapper on the edge of a flattish reef and uses the discoloured water to his advantage, sneaking up on the wily fish. The new ledge looks promising, with numerous smaller fish around. Before long, Jeremy proves that the fish population does have potential, bagging a bigger snapper from a small cave. As we move further down the coast, the reef becomes more substantial with bigger ledges and a lot more reef life. The first game fish of the trip makes an appearance, and Steve makes no bones about landing the Jack Crevalle. Having spent quite a few hours in the bad visibility, the divers are becoming accustomed to the trying conditions. Jeremy spots a big snapper holed up in a labyrinth of caves. After grovelling around in the crevices, he finally gets a shot in and soon gets seriously reefed by the fish. After a long tussle involving multiple dives, pulling, pushing and fighting the snapper inside the cave, kicking up clouds of sediment, the fish entrenched itself solidly behind a boulder. The only choice to retrieve the fish and spear was to work it towards the back door of the cave system. Eventually, Jeremy manages to extract the snapper through one of these back entrances, having to remove the spear from the fish before being able to head back to the surface. Deciding to call it a day, Carisco heads back to the Rio Tonde, idling upstream to admire the pristine forest that grows down to the riverbanks. Back at the compound, the expedition begins to look south of Bata, towards the Gabonese border. According to the dated chart information, there are much larger reef systems down here. This, combined with the relatively low human population, holds promise for bigger and better fish stocks. With the use of GPS plotting software, we plan the route into water seldom navigated. decision is taken to load the two boats with enough fuel and equipment for the 110-kilometer trip to Punta Negra, a wild promontory on the southern border of Equatorial Guinea. This means launching two boats at the Rio Tonde once again, and this time heading south on what was to be an epic voyage of discovery. On the way to the mouth, the crew come across a local spearfisherman diving in the muddy water of the Rio Tonde. The journey takes approximately 6 hours, with the sea not as calm as usual. The crew feels the effects of a moderate headwind, making for a tedious journey. Along the way, local ocean-going dugouts show their superior design for the short chop encountered on this coast. On rounding Punta Negra, the forests of Gabon are visible down the coast. The boats enter what was to be their own private bay, shrouded by a tall canopy forest, with the trees literally overshadowing the sea. When we arrived at Punta Negra, we rounded the point, and on the first glimpse of the bay, I just couldn't help wondering how many other people had actually been to this place. And it's got to be a handful, because it is completely untouched. There's one family living in the bay, no roads, no litter, no impact on the environment. It is absolutely pristine, like the day it was created. The other thing that struck me was the size of the trees that verged onto the beach. They must have been about 30 or 40 meters high. And just taking in this scale was difficult enough.
Probably the most beautiful place I've ever seen in my life, and like other members of our party, I also wondered how many people had had the privilege of seeing such a wonderful spot. The other thing that impressed me about Punta Negra were the caves.
After exploring the bay, the gear is packed into the forest hut that was to be the team's base for the next few days. At sundown, Carusco is moored out in the bay, and Sea Hunter is beached high up on the sand to avoid the tide. Bunking down in Campanophiles is somewhat different to the compound in Barter, but the surroundings add a degree of authenticity to the adventure. The morning dawns grey and humid, and Jeremy, Steve and Tim prepare to head out to Banco Lauria for another exploratory dive. Lauria is 4 miles offshore, and because of this the water is substantially cleaner than the inshore areas. For the first time, the divers can get a good idea of their immediate environment beneath the surface. Once again, the idea is to find the fish.
Very large cracks, very nice undercut caves, not a lot of growth, but holds a lot of fish. It looks like right in the cracks, like big boulders all tumbled together. Yeah, pretty good.
Steve lines up on a nice snapper and lets rip with his railgun. This turns out to be a really nice fish in the 15 kilogram range. Black margate are hefty bottom-dwelling species, and Steve finds a big one lurking in a gully. After stalking it for some time, he manages to middle the fish. Meanwhile, Jeremy has been hunting along a good-looking ledge with a broad overhang. The biggest advantage of spearfishing is its selectivity, and the divers are now only on the hunt for the bigger fish. Smaller ones are left alone. he suddenly sees a big snapper darting for cover and intercepts it at a gully. To top off the day, Steve manages another Jack Crevalle, and this time it's a lot bigger. A good sign for Bancolaria. Satisfied that they at least have an idea of the potential of this reef as a light tackle and scuba diving location, they board Sea Hunter to head back to Punta Negra for a debriefing.
Down in this area, although it was a long trip to come down, things have improved a lot. Visibility is a lot better. We probably had about 15 meters, maybe 16 meters. We could make out reef in that depth, and the fish are a lot bigger.
Yeah, it was a hell of a drive. The furthest I've ever driven in the ski boat, 110 kilometers. Hell of a long way to go for a few fish.
Afternoon tea is not a new pastime in the colonies and is a perfect break before exploring the jungle behind the bay. The Gabon viper hails from these parts and is perfectly camouflaged in the leaf litter of the forest floor. This typical canopy forest is home to chimpanzees and African grey parrots and is still in the same pristine state that it was at the beginning of time. Bursting back out of the forest, it's time to get back to the beach to make some adjustments to the spearfishing gear that's been working so hard.
I wish I was back in Dive Factory workshop. At least I'd have a vise and a proper hammer.
That night at Campanophiles, a tropical storm hits, and by morning, the downpour has kept the party in the hut, waiting for a hint of a break in the deluge. Finally, the storm dissipates, and hurried arrangements are made to load all the gear onto the boats again. The team put to sea on the return trip with the bad weather never really abating, and passed the single oil rig off Equatorial Guinea's coast. The temptation is all too much, and Tim radios to get permission to take a look under the SBN buoy, as the rig is strictly out of bounds. The sounder is indicating some serious shoals of fish at about 25 meters, and the divers go over to have a look. Nothing could have prepared Graeme and Jeremy for the numbers and size of great barracuda that were literally swarming around the chains and pipes of the SBN. We got quite a fright because on entering the water, there were just hundreds and thousands of huge great barracuda all over the place. Wherever you looked, they were above you, below you, next to you. It was unbelievable, just the size and volume of the fish. As I dived down with the camera, it got darker and darker, and at about 25, 26 meters, the water actually became black. The camera iris was wide open and the picture was still incredibly dark. And it was down here that huge snapper came up from the chains of the SBN buoy, and shoals of Jack Crevalles came swimming past, and then always the huge barracuda were just all around you. Another squall blows in from the Atlantic, and Sea Hunter drifts with the wind until the sea settles, at which point the boats begin to head back to Bata. With the monsoon season building, the King Air leaves Bata Airport for Annobon. This is the most anticipated part of the trip, as very little is known about the island, and the team are anxious to see a change in conditions. Annobon lies approximately 500 kilometers offshore, and the last charted information was from 1936. Diving here would mean that the underwater environment would be completely unexplored and unexploited. For this reason, expectation on the aircraft is running high. As if on cue, as the King Air approaches the island, the clouds break and the sun reveals the steep mountainous terrain dropping into the blue sea. This was a very different colour to the green water around Bata. And on landing, there was a rush to get everything off the aeroplane and onto any available boat. Annobon was a Portuguese colony until fairly recently, and all that remains of this is a looming cathedral amongst the palms. The 400-odd people live in very basic conditions, surviving on a diet of fish, mangoes and cassava. Walking through the village settlement, the poverty of these simple people was offset by their friendliness and enthusiasm. The boat turned out to be a fiberglass version of the dugouts that we'd seen on the mainland, complete with trusty Yamaha outboard that Damian retrieved from out of the front of a dumpster. The dubious-looking skipper, who was christened Cyclops, promptly proceeded with his standard maintenance routine, which apparently is a prerequisite to putting to sea. Finally on the ocean, it became apparent that the water off Annobon was considerably cleaner and possibly amongst the clearest any of us had seen anywhere. A flat, clear sea and blue skies are a fisherman's dream. And before long, the old man of the sea was into a big wahoo. This was within a few hundred meters from shore, and with ample help from Cyclops, the fish is hauled in and gaffed. With the first decent game fish already on the boat, and the divers not even wet yet, there is a scurry to be the first overboard. On breaking the surface, the action begins. Schools of mantas scatter off into the deep water, and a huge whale shark keeps circling onto the ledge at 20 meters. The volcanic rock drop-off is always looming behind, with the indigo blue open Atlantic in front. The divers revel in the perfect conditions. The exploration of the reefs begins, and this in itself is an awesome experience. Jeremy finds a shoal of black kingfish at the 28-meter line on the drop-off and bags the first fish off Annobon. Trying to anticipate the correct depth here is extremely difficult because of the clean water, and the divers are cautious to watch how far down the drop-off they're drifting. Black kingfish are short, strong fish that give a good account of themselves. This one weighed in at 18 kilograms. With the current pushing strongly against the steep drop-off, Jeremy chases a huge tuna, which keeps its distance in the crystal water. We estimated this fish at around 100 kilograms, but couldn't get a decent shot in. Steve has managed to bag a nice big barracuda, and he swims the fish to the surface. While all this was happening, Tim managed to get a shot at another big tuna. Shooting the fish in the head, it unfortunately swam off the drop-off into deep water, and not being able to hold the big fish, it disappeared into the Atlantic with a carbon railgun and float in tow, much to Tim's frustration.
Underneath the water. Then it came up, and it was like bobbing up, one third out of the surface. Oh, ever so frustrating, I tell you.
With the fish now substantially bigger and more plentiful, the gear needs to be adjusted to cope with the change in conditions. Guns need attention to ensure clinical accuracy in the clean water, where long shots are the norm.
Okay, what I've rigged up for tomorrow's diving is a buoyancy that's 15 meters long, but it stretches to 60 meters. And I've got another 20 meters of ordinary float line on the end of that, just to protect, just to stand up to any chafe on the reef. And then that's going to be attached to a single 35-litre float line. The reason for this is that today, due to unforeseen circumstances, we managed to lose a whole rig.
As evening approaches, the scenery on Annobon comes alive, with the sea constantly changing from blue to grey and then to orange. Life goes on, oblivious to the matters of the world, and each day seems to repeat itself, triggered by sunrise and sunset. The next day sees the team heading around to the weather side of the island. As the sea gets rougher, the cousins appear ahead. These are rocky pinnacles that just break the surface out of very deep water, with screaming currents eddying around them. From below the surface, the scenery is awesome. Steep rocky walls and caves break the surface amidst heaving blue water. A narrow ledge of sand and rock at 30 meters gives a little perspective before the bottom plunges away. The steepness of the walls, the clean water, and the sharp change in depth, combined with the disconcerting current, makes for exciting diving, but very difficult spearfishing. The ever-present shoal of barracuda appear, but the divers are after different species here. Big snapper shoal on the deep ledge, and seem to know the difference between a spear gun and a camera. Jeremy finally manages to outwit a nice specimen. A really good fish in this tiring environment. Steve, while stalking the snapper, comes across a big Indian mirrorfish, and it takes a little while to bring this deep-bodied fish in. With the current now picking up with the tide, the divers are pushed into the bottomless Atlantic, and once the fish is loaded, it is decided to head back to the beach, stopping for a quick look at the drop-off at Tortuga. With calmer conditions and a less violent current aside, there was comfort in the familiarity of Tortuga Island. Hoping to find another big tuna, Steve dives and bumps into a big shoal of barracuda. Having taken a shot at one of the bigger ones, he wrestles the fish closer, only to find that it's a huge specimen, bigger than any of us had ever seen.
Managed to get to the float, pulled it in, was to discover that after pulling a little lightly, that the barb was showing through. Dived down, pulled a little harder to get the barb to go through again, and the whole spear came out. Anyway, managed to re-stab it. End of the day, it was lucky we got it out. And the one I shot looked about a 10, 15 kilo. Some there looked sort of over 20. But yeah, it was a lot bigger than we expected. Really big.
This was a trophy fish, and the divers wondered whether bigger ones had been overlooked in the deceptively clear water. Hauling a fish like this on board is only a pleasure, and after this great catch, diving is shelved for the day.
We've had the cleanest water of the whole trip today, probably between 20 and 30 meters. But surprisingly, it's been the coldest water. Even with a 3mm wetsuit top, you get chilly after an hour or so in the water. Completely different to the coastal water and even to Ponta Negra, where we had a bit of viz.
To take a break from diving, the group decide to leave the beach and walk into the crater of Annobon's dormant volcano. Huge trees reminiscent of Ponta Negra dominate the scenery here, and the water's edge is lined with what we came to know as typical West African forest. The feeling of isolation is intense. With one more day left on the trip, A strange nostalgia is beginning to well up inside each of us. We have one more day to make the most of Annabon. The following morning, preparations are made without the usual noisy banter. Each is conscious of the fact that, while having discovered amazing pieces of coast and awesome reefs, time has run out, and there still hasn't been any indication of game fish in the numbers that the expedition was expecting. The final opportunity has arrived. A last morning dive off the island is a make-or-break attempt to reveal the potential of Annabon as a game fishing mecca. Instead of dropping on Tortuga Point as usual, the boat heads further up current into the deep water on the edge of the Tortuga ledge. The Rob Allen flashes are set, and the divers find themselves staring into the indigo water once again. As the current pushes onto the ledge, out of the blue appear legions of sleek silver shapes. Shoals of wahoo come onto the flashes, and faced with 40 or 50 fish at a time, spearfishing mayhem ensues. The wahoo, being by nature an untrusting fish, keep their distance, and with the clean water posing another challenge, getting a spear into these fish is pretty difficult. Steve draws first blood and sneaks in for a classic subsurface shot. The fish takes off on the searing run for which it's so well known. Tim corners another specimen just below and with clinical accuracy places his spear in the middle of the fish. The wahoo are still coming through in numbers, and next it's Jeremy's turn to bag a nice one. As he looks up, a sitter appears, and he makes no mistakes. On the slow-mo, as the Rob Allen gun explodes, the spear hits the wahoo dead center. The fish almost drops a gear on impact, and the pace at which the line is taken has to be felt to be believed. Even with gloves, the burn can be felt in the water. Affectionately known by fishermen as one-run wonders, the wahoo generally spend all their explosive energy on this first run. And once that's over, the diver has to pull in 40-odd meters of line to retrieve the fish. This specimen gets cornered between two divers and gets a little too close to Damian, who puts in a great shot with his new Rob Allen gun, in the process bagging his first wahoo. The drift ends at the sheer drop-off at Tortuga, and the little boat fetches the divers, now all split up after the chaos of the wahoo shoal. With a decent bag on the boat, the divers are now content that they have realized the potential of Annabon, even if this was just scratching the surface. In the blur of a hasty departure, the trip seems to slip away into the back of our memories. All too soon we trade the gentle Atlantic breeze of the island for cabin air conditioning, and it's as if we're back where we started. Except this time, there's the faint smell of fish as we fight the airways staff. The memory of rich green forest and pristine blue water will be translated into a report that will tell firsthand of a place thick with fish, rich in unusual marine life, and host to underwater cathedrals for divers to explore. Places like this are not supposed to exist in our era, and the only hope is that this can remain, along with the oil.